We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 56a. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that by Trumas Meiser of Demai, we are strict and we say there's a halach of Chomesh. That's talking about in a situation where somebody who's not a Kohen eats it by mistake. And Rebbe Lazar asked on the Mishnah, why is it that we're so strict when we're talking about Demai? It's just a Derabanan. And so Rebbe Lazar said that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds when it comes to Gittin, that when it comes to Derabanans, we're strict just like the Oraisas. So over here as well, even though it's Derabanan, we want to strengthen the Derabanan, and we make it like a Doraisa. And so the Gemara asked a question on that because we say by Meiser Sheni of Demai that you're allowed to redeem, let's say, Kesef on the Choshes. Let's say you have a silver coin, you can redeem it onto a copper coin. And we find from the Mishnah in Meiser Sheni that that's actually something that's generally not done. And the case over there in the Mishnah in Meiser Sheni is you have a seller of Meiser Sheni gets mixed up with another seller, and it says that you should redeem that, you should redeem it onto copper coins, then back onto silver coins. And the Mishnah continues, Mimnesha Amru, because they say, Mechalin oso Kesef al Nechoshes midochek, that if you have a situation, a dochik situation, a shas adachak, you're forced into it, so then we'll allow you to redeem silver onto copper. Lo sheyikayim kain, and you shouldn't keep it that way. You shouldn't keep it on copper, meaning you shouldn't keep the copper coins as coins of Meiser Sheni. Ela shechozer u'mechalan ala kesef. Rather, you go and you take that kedusha and you put it back on the silver coin. And so the point of the Gemara is, Katani mihas, nevertheless, what does it say over here? It says, Mechalin midochik. It says, because it's a shas hadachak, so you're allowed to do this. Midochik in shalom midochik lo. It sounds like only in a shas hadachak. Otherwise, you're not allowed to. And yet, by demai, you're allowed to. So here we see the opposite. Here we see a leniency when it comes to demai. And Rashi explains, Mimnesha Amru Kolomar, what it means to say is as follows, Lefikach his kiku l'chalela, the reason why they made him go through this whole procedure, L'chalo tchila b'mos, to first redeem it onto copper coins, V'chozer mechal hamos, and then you go ahead and take the copper coins and put the kedusha back onto the silver. V'lo Amru, and they didn't just say something much simpler, Sheyitol hayafesh b'hen, just take the nicer one of the sellers, the nicer one of the silver coins. V'yomer, he should just say as follows, Imzu shal Meiser harei tov, if this is the coin of Meiser, very good, because the whole point is they got mixed up. V'imzu shal chulin, and if this is not the one of Meiser, harei shal Meiser mechulelas also, then I'm going to redeem the one of Meiser onto this one. And the reason why they don't do that simple solution, instead you have to involve the copper coins, is mimnei shamru mechalin kesef al nechoshes midochik, because they said that you're allowed to do silver on copper in a shas hadachak, avol kesef al kesef lav derechilulhu, but to do silver on silver already, that's not a normal way of redemption. V'afilu midochik namilo, even in a shas hadachak, we would not allow that. V'kevan da'af kesef al nechoshes lo hitir el bedochik. Now, if it's true that even silver on copper is only in a shas hadachak, hilkach lo sheyikayim kain, we're not going to actually keep it that way, that the copper coins remain with the kedushas Meiser Sheni, shabi zoyon Meiser, that's already disgrace to Meiser, v'yocha prutos machlidos, also the copper coins, they become rusty. In any case, the question is, katani mias, nevertheless, what does it say? Gabi Meiser vaday midochik in shalom midochik lo, it says by regular Meiser, here we're talking about Meiser Sheni that's not demai, by Meiser Sheni that's Meiser Sheni vaday, you can only do it in shas hadachak. V'kevan damar kesef al nechoshes midochik in shalom midochik lo. Now, if we're saying that you're only allowed to do kesef on nechoshes in a situation of shas hadachak, v'gabei demai tanim mechalin, but by demai we say it's fine, it's totally okay to do kesef on nechoshes. Alma le Rabbi Meir lo asu bo chizik. You see, according to Rabbi Meir, that we're not strengthening the derabanan. That's the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Yosef says, Afal pi shemekel Rabbi Meir bepidyono, even though it's true that Rabbi Meir is lenient when it comes to redeeming Meiser Sheni of Demai, machmir hu b'achilaso, but he is machmir when it comes to eating it. That's what the Mishnah is dealing with. When we talk about paying the fifth, we're talking about eating it. Rashi says, machmir hu b'achilaso shel Meiser Sheni shel Demai, umasnisin b'achilakai. Again, if it would come to eating Meiser Sheni of Demai, we would be strict. In our Mishnah also, it's talking about Trumas Meiser of Demai, it's talking about eating, and that's why we are more strict. And the Gemara continues, the Tanya, as we learned in a Brayso, lo hitiru limchor demai el siton belvad. The only person that's allowed to sell demai is a siton, that refers to a wholesaler. Ubalabayis beinkach uveinkach tzarich la'aser. Balabayis always needs to take off the meiser. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. V'chachamim omrim, the chachamim say echad hasiton v'echad balabayis, whether he's a wholesaler or whether he's a balabayis, mocher v'sholech l'chaveru, he can sell, he can send to his friend, v'nosen lo b'matan, and give a gift. V'eno choshesh, and there is no concern. And Rashi explains, Lo hitiru limchor demai, lo hitiru lechaver halokech demai. We're talking here about a chaver who buys demai, again from an amoretz. Shim cherenu lachem, they did not allow him to sell to others, ad sheyaser, unless he actually takes off meiser first. And Rashi continues, Ela lesiton bilvad, siton chaver. Now, if the chaver that buys the demai is a siton, he is a wholesaler, lo hitzrichu la'aser, there they did not require him to take off meiser. Ela mochro kashu demai, he can actually sell it as demai v'halocho mimenu yafresh masrosav. And the buyer, the person who buys it from him, he'll separate the meiser. And the reasoning of this distinction is shahakol yodin. Everybody knows shahasiton mikama amei haaretz lokeach. A siton, a wholesaler, is buying from a lot of different amei haaretz. Shahasiton min hamashbi and limchor b'mida gasu, because of the siton, the wholesaler is selling in bulk. Darko liknos peros merubin. He buys a lot of produce. Umochron lechenvonim, and then he sells it to storekeepers. Uvalabais, but when it comes to the balabais, the private individual halokech me'am haaretz who buys from an am haaretz, bein kach uvein kach. It doesn't matter if he's doing it in bulk or not. Bein shabol lachzer v'limchor b'mida gasu lechenvonim kesiton. Whether he's going to sell it in bulk to storekeepers like a siton. Bein shabol lachzer v'limchor b'mida daka kechenvonim, or whether he's going to sell little by little like a storekeeper, bechanos, pruta, just a little by little in a store. Tzarich la'aser kodem sheyimchor. But again, if it's a balabais, he needs to take off meiser before he sells, lefisha lokech mimeno, because anyone who buys from a balabais, savur shein mi peirosar, so he thinks it's just coming from this person's own produce. V'kevan shu chaver, and since this balabais is a chaver, machzikan oso becheskas sheisr, people will think that meiser was taken off, v'ein mafrishin, and so they won't separate. That's why we are stricter when it comes to a balabais, according to Rabbi Meir. And Rashi continues, the Chachamim say echot siton v'echot balabayis, whether we're talking about a siton or a balabayis. Shebo limchor b'mida gas, if he's coming to sell, meaning the person, even if he's a balabayis, but he's selling in bulk, kederech hamashbiin, or kederech hasitonos, mocher v'sholech l'chavero shecheskas kol hamochrim v'nosim b'mida gas. According to the Chachamim, anyone who's selling or giving in bulk, b'cheskas shelo isro, there's already a chazak, it's a presumption they didn't take off meiser, d'mayhe v'alokech mehem ma'aser v'ochel, and anyone who buys from them knows they have to take off meiser because there's a concern of demai. Over Meseches demai meforish ezumi the gasa biyavish lo shakabin belach shave dinar. It explains over there in demai what's considered a midagasa, what's considered bulk. By dry, it's 3 kav. By something that's moist, it's going to be a dinar. And so the point over here is that Rabbi Meir, we see is strict. The Chachamim, they're allowing anyone to sell in bulk. It doesn't matter balabayis or siton. It's okay when it comes to demai. Whereas Rabbi Meir, since we're talking about achila, Rabbi Meir says only the siton is allowed to sell in bulk without taking off meiser. The balabayis has to take off meiser since it concerns achila. Rabbi Meir is strict, and that's what the Gemara is bringing a proof, that when it comes to achila, Rabbi Meir is strict by demai. And the Gemara continues, Meisiv Ravina asked the following question from a Mishnah in Demai, Halokech min hanachtam, if somebody buys from the baker, Ma'asr min achama alatzonenes, he can take off meiser from the warm bread on the cold, umin hatzonenes alachaman, from the cold on the warm, v'afilu midefusim harbe, even from many different molds, divrei Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And the Gemara now says, B'shlama min hatzonenes alachaman. Now I understand why he's allowed to take from the cold on the warm. Kid Rabbi Eloi, that's like what Rabbi Eloi said. Amar Rabbi Eloi said, Minayin l'torim min hara la yafa. How do you know if someone takes truma from the bad on the good? Shet truma, so truma, that truma is considered to be good truma. Shenemar, as it says, v'lo sisu olav chet b'harimchem eschel bo mimenu. It says it shouldn't be a sin when you take off the truma. Emeino kodesh nesias chet lama. Now, if it's not already holy, if it wasn't effective, why is there a sin over here? From here we learn l'torim and hara la yafa, that if someone takes truma from the bad on the good, shet truma, so truma, that is a good truma. But we have to understand, says the Gemara, afilu midfusim harbe, it says that he's allowed to take off even from many different molds. Leichosh dilma asi lafrushim and achiv al aptur umin aptur al achiv. We should be concerned that maybe he's separating from something that is chayv in maestris and something that is pater in maestris, and vice versa. And the fact that Rabbi Meir is not concerned, so here we see again that he is lenient by demai. That's the question of the Gemara. And Rashi explains, Min hanachtom am haaretz, the person is buying the bread from a baker who is an am haaretz. It's a situation of demai. Maaser demai menacham, he takes off ma'aser and the demai from the warm on the cold, and vice versa. Ve'afilu min defus and harbe, he's even allowed to do it from different molds, meaning ein hakikarus domos azulazu, even if the different loaves are not similar to one another. Ve'eshlam shanachtom hazel lokach kikarus shel defus zeh meish echad, ve'kikarus shel defus zeh meish acher, and so therefore there's a concern. Maybe the baker brought the loaves of one mold, he brought it from one person, and the loaves that look different, he brought it from someone else. V'yamei haaretz, and when it comes to amei haaretz, yesh mehem shem asrin, some take off meiser, v'yesh mehem she'ein masrin, some don't take off meiser. V'shem azelo yisr v'zeh yisr, so now you have a problem. Maybe this one meiser was taken off, that one meiser was not taken off. V'hamafresh mizeh al zen, if you're going to take off from one on the other, mafresh min achiv al aptur, so you could have a problem. You're taking off from something which is chayv in meiser and something which is pater. V'yein shein meiser chol olav, and therefore what you took off is not really meiser. V'nosan tevel a kohen, he's actually giving tevel to the kohen. O min haptor al achiv, or it could be the other way around. He's taking from something that is exempt on something that's obligated. Vein shem meiser chal olav, it's not really meiser. Vein nimtza shein shekenegdo mesukin, so that which you think you fixed, you didn't really fix. So the point over here is lo chayshinan b'dmai lahachi. The point over here is Rabbi Meir is saying we're not concerned because this is only demai. We don't have such concerns. V'tolinan l'meimer mechad gavr zaven. You can assume that it all came from one person, that he bought it from one person, and so therefore the Gemara is asking v'asu chizuk k'shel Torah. Now, if you're saying that when it comes to demai, when it comes to the derabbanans, we strengthen it like the doraisa. B'shalom minatzonenes alacham. I understand from the cold on the warm. Afal pishacham yafa minatzonenes. Even though warm is higher quality than the cold, lo chayshin, and that's not a concern. Could Rabbi Loi, like Rabbi Loi says. However, when it comes elam in defusam harbe nechosh dilma mafresh min aptur, when it comes to different kinds of molds, there we really should have a concern. And so again, you see, we're not being strict when it comes to demai, according to Rabbi Meir. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Abaya. Abaya says, Rabbi Lozer shaper kakashale. Rabbi Lozer, his initial question, that's the initial question from the previous Amar that he asked on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, when it comes to demai, we're strict by the chomesh. We say there's a halach of 1/5 if you eat it by mistake, talking about trumas ma'aser shel demai. Rabbi Lozer said, why are we so strict? That was a good question. Ushmuel lo shaper kamashani le, and then Shmuel's answer was not actually a good answer. And Abai explains the kasha le Rebbe Lozer, because the initial question of Rebbe Lozer was misa dividei shamayim. He was talking about a case of misa bidei shamayim, meaning to say that situation over there when we're talking about eating trumas meiser, you're talking about a potential sin that involves a chiyuv misa bidei shamayim. Umeshani le Shmuel, and then Shmuel answered. Shmuel's answer was from the case of gittin, that we find that Rabbi Meir is very strict when it comes to get. He strengthens the derabanan as though it was a doraisa, and therefore he says that's what's happening in our mission as well. However, the problem is that's misas bezin. The problem is when you're dealing with issues of eishes ish, that's not misa bidei shamayim, that's misas bezin. Misas bezin is stricter, so therefore you can't really say just because Rabbi Meir is strict by something that involves misas bezin, you can't necessarily say that he's going to be strict with something that involves misa bidei shamayim. Dil mashani misas bezin the chamira. Maybe misas bezin is different; it's more strict, so you can't necessarily bring a proof from that case of gittin to our case. And then Abai continues, "V'Rav Sheshes lo shapir kamosivle," and Rav Sheshes he's not asking a good question. Why? The Amri inhu misa, because again they're talking about a situation of misa. Umosiv Rav Sheshes lav. Rav Sheshes' question involved a lav. Rav Sheshes' question involved the issue of redeeming Meiser Sheni. Again, it seemed like Rabbi Meir was being lenient when it came to redeeming Meiser Sheni of Demai, but that only at most that only involves a lav. Let's say the redemption was not good, so then you're going to be eating the Meiser Sheni. You'll be eating it outside of Yerushalayim. That's just a lav. T'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, lo sucha lechol b'sharech. It says you can't eat it in your gates. You can't eat it outside of Yerushalayim. So what are you asking a question? Of course, over there we're going to be lenient when all it involves is a lav. That's not a good question. And then Abaye continues, ulamai demos of Rav Sheshes. Now, if you're going to accept Rav Sheshes' question, Rav Yosef Shaper Kamashani, Rav Yosef gives a good answer. Rav Yosef makes a distinction between pidyon, redemption, and between achila. But now finally we get to Ravina. Ravina's question over here. Ravina's question is from the nachtom, from the baker, and it seems by the baker, again, Rabbi Meir is being lenient. So Ella Ravina, rather, when it comes to Ravina, at the most of minachtom, instead of asking a question from the case of the baker, l'sayeh lemi palter, you could actually support what we're saying from palter. The case of palter is the merchant. Again, this is the merchant who sells the bread, and that would actually be a support for what we're saying. The Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, halokech min hapalter, it says if you buy from the merchant, ma'aser mikol defus or defus, you have to take meiser off every mold, each one you have to treat individually, you have to be strict. And so here you see an example where we're actually strict when it comes to the cases of Demai. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And so therefore, instead of asking from Nachtom, you could have really supported this idea that Rabbi Meir is strict from the case of Palter. And so therefore, ultimately, the answer is as follows. Rather, what do you have to say? We say as follows. Palter mitrei telasa gavra zavin. When it comes to a palter, a merchant, he's buying from 2 or 3 different people, and that's why we're more strict, because again, you don't really know what's going on, whether Meiser was taken from this demai or not. But nachtom nami mechad gavra hu zavin. But a nachtom, a baker, he can buy all from one person, and that's why we're lenient in that case. But then the Gemara continues, Rava Amar Rava says, Shmuel Shaper Kamashani, like going all the way back to the initial answer of Shmuel, where Shmuel says that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir, who's strict by Gittin, so he's strict over here. That actually was a good answer. Why? Because Shem Misa Ba'olam, it's all generally death penalty situations. The fact that one of them is Misa B'dei Shamayim and one of them is Misas Bezin, that does not make a difference. And Rashi explains, Kasha lo garsinan de Abaya trutze commentaries don't have the girsa here of Kasha, because Abaya is coming and giving an answer. And Abai says like this, Amar Abai, Rabbi Lozer de Kasha later. Rabbi Lozer's initial question was, V'chiyasu chizik, are we so strict by the Rabbanans? Shaper Kasha le, that was a good Kasha. Ushmuel Deshani Hamani Rabbi Meir, then Shmuel answered that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir, V'aisi Raya min Hamevi get. He brings a proof from this case of get. Lo Shaper Shani le, that's not a good answer. Can Mefarish V'yazel, as the Gemara now explains. The Kasha le Rabbi Lozer, V'chiyasu chizik b'Trumas Meister shal Demai Shikala. Rabbi Lozer asked, are we going to be so strict about Trumas Meister of Demai, which is lenient, Shafilu Truma Vadoi, saying Ella, B'misa b'dei Shamayim Zarachla, because even if it was real Truma, if a non-Kohen eats it, it's just going to be Misa b'dei Shamayim. Umeshani le Shmuel sha'asu chizik l'divrei be'eshes ish. And the Shmuel's answer is that we're very strict by the Derabbanans of eshes ish. She'eser Torah shabam Misa b'dei Adam. There we're talking about Misa b'dei Adam, we're talking about Misas Bezdin. V'yichamur, that's much stricter. You can't really bring a proof from that. But Rav Sheshes the Osvei l'Shmuel. Then Rav Sheshes comes along and he asks a question on Shmuel, Michilo, from the case of redemption by Meiser Sheni of Demai, Shalawasu bo chizik b'chilo shel Demai, that we're not so strict when it comes to the redemption of Demai Meiser Sheni. Lav Shapir Osvei, that's not a good question. The chilo kilo avid le Shapir, because when it comes to chil, if you don't do it properly, lav bialmu, that's just a lav that you're eating Meiser Sheni outside Yerushalayim. The lo sucha lechol v'gomer, that's just a lav of lo sucha lechol. Well, Lamai dosef Rav Sheshes Rav Yosef Shapir kashani lein. According to the question Rav Sheshes asked, Rav Yosef did give a good answer. The Ava Bishameko Rav Meir b'pidyono, because we're going to say that Rav Meir makes a distinction between pidyon, redemption, and eating. But then the Gemara said that when it comes to the question from Nachtom, you could have actually brought a support from Palter. The Palter is hula inyan kikaros kesiton. A Palter is the same thing as a siton, a wholesaler that's just by loaves of bread. It's called a Palter linyan tvua. It's called a siton by grain, and it's called a Palter by loaves of bread. Lokech kikaros harbe umocher lechenvanim ulanachtomim. He buys many loaves and then he sells it to the storekeepers and the bakers. Master me called defus udefus, and then he takes meiser from all the different molds. In that case, we're stricter. Al machayish dil masi lefrushim and achiv al aptori. There you see there is a concern that you might be separating from something that's chayiv and something that's pater. Elamayis lach lememar. Rather, what do you have to say? Maishna dechayish al palter mishum demitrei telasazav. And the reason why we're more concerned by the palter is because he buys from 2 to 3 people. Nachtom nami de lo chayish le Rav Meir. When Rav Meir is not concerned by nachtom, lo tikshilach. That's not a question. The kasavar nachtom mitoch shein lokech harve biyachid, because he holds since a baker does not buy a lot at once. Talil lememar echad gaver zav, and we assume he bought from one person. It happens that one person will make loaves in different molds. And the Gemara continues in the Mishnah, Elu devarim she'ein lehem onah, the following onah, the halachas of exploitation, do not apply to the following: ha'avodim, slaves, v'hashtaros, and documents, v'hakarkos, and land, v'hakdeshos, and hekdesh, she'ein lehen tashlumei kefil. There's no halacha of tashlumei kefil, of paying double, v'lo tashlumei arba v'chamisha. There's no halacha of paying 4 or 5 times the amount. Shomer chinam eino nishba, shomer chinam doesn't swear with these things, v'nosei sachar eino meshalim, a shomer sachar doesn't pay. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, we'll take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Elu devarim she'ein lahem onah b'gemar mefarish taima. The Gemara will explain the reason why there's no onah. Hashtaros is documents, means hamocher shtaros ligvos chov shebesocho. The person is selling a document and the buyer is going to use the document to collect the debt. V'yitlen alatzmo, will take it for himself. V'hakdeshos, hektish refers to gizbar hamocher hektish. Let's say a gizbar, the treasurer of the Beis HaMikdash, is selling something that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, or hamocher olaso shenafal bo mumur. Let's say a person has a carbanola and the animal has a blemish and he's selling that. V'lo tashlumei arba v'chamish. And also, let's say you have a ganav by these things, there's no payment of kefil or 4 or 5 times the amount. Im tavach or let's say the case was with an animal that he slaughtered or sold. Umishom hekdeshos itzrich lemis. Now the reason why we're teaching this is really in terms of hekdesh. Deilo avodim ushtaros v'karkos, because when it comes to avodim, shtaros, and karkos, lo shaykh lemeimar, there is no such thing anyway as arba v'chamish. It's only going to be by hekdesh where you have an animal. 4 or 5 times the amount only applies by animals. Deilo tashlumei arba v'chamisha eina no heges ela b'shor v'seb levad, because again 4 or 5 times the amount applies only to ox and sheep. And then it said that a shomer chinam does not swear. Eino nishba means shalo pasha. He doesn't swear that there was no negligence. Shalo hizki kaso Torah lishava alei, and the Torah does not obligate the person to swear over these items. And also shomer sachar, he's eino mishalim, he doesn't pay im nignavu mimenu if they are stolen from him. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis.